yeah, talk today about prediction of the maze and looking at the English indefinite contrast on and probabilistic pre-activation. So where I'd like to start is with this now sort of famous sentence, the day was breezy, so the little boy went out to fly, where we think there's some kind of semantic prediction that's built up over the sentence context that predicts the word kite. And kite itself actually has certain kinds of phonological and orthographic properties such that you can get a form prediction from this for the indefinite article that its form needs to be in this case. This sentence was made famous by DeLong in the 2005 Nature paper, noting that the prediction for kite, high close probability here. There's also a high close for this particular form of the indefinite article. And that's in comparison to another potential alternative like airplane that's just not as high close, but importantly also differs in its article form, so versus on. And the real insight that this study, along with many others around this time period, had was to take a look at what's happening at that indefinite article form, time lock it to ERPs and take a look and say, what's going on there? Do we see any differences here prior to the expected noun form itself? And in fact, that's exactly what they did. They time lock them both to either the article or the noun. At the noun, they find a classic N400 effect, graded such that as noun close increases, the amplitude decreased there. And then similarly, they recorded an effect on articles that was also arguably graded. And they used this to argue that that was evidence for probabilistic pre-activation. Right, so results like this have been really critical to underpinning our current ideas of predictive mechanisms in language comprehension because they're taken as fairly decisive in terms of the argument about prediction versus integration. And we've seen these in a variety of different languages and different levels, so things that are more semantic like animacy agreement in Polish, a whole variety of studies on gender agreement, and then phonotactic cases like the English on distinction. But these cases have more recently especially shown fragility in replication. So gender agreement has a fairly recent large-scale case following up from these phonotactic on distinctions, probably most famously in the Neuland 2018 large-scale replication. And when taking a look at this literature, the question that pops to my mind is why are there so few phonotactic studies on the English constraint? And that's especially given how much we often use English in psycholinguistics. And then the other thing to note is that these studies are all really ERP studies. And I don't think these two facts are really unrelated. I think there's certain methodological issues with studying the English in contrast that make ERPs a really good methodology to use. But this therefore limits the ability to do other kinds of studies around this. And so what I want to try to do today is introduce a different methodology that might also be sensitive to these kinds of effects, the maze task. It's a very useful methodology these days because on the one hand, it's relatively cheap, but now also thanks to Boyce and colleagues from 2020, it's easy to deploy using their automated maze pipeline and our online tools. So I've got a couple of goals today. I want to first demonstrate that the maze task is sensitive to these local form prediction failures and use the English in contrast for that. So I'm going to try to show that the maze task is response times are focal enough to detect that prediction failure on the article itself. And then having shown that, I'm going to try to show that given that response times are a slightly different type of data, it offers us a different empirical viewpoint that we can view for prediction effects that might have advantages all its own, separately from what we typically do methodologically. All right, so just to begin, I want to just note why am I not talking about other incremental reading methodologies? Why aren't these typically used for this kind of study? I mean, there's a couple of reasons. So first, eye movements, are moderately expensive in general. Right? You have to bring participants into labs, something quite difficult these days to do. The eye tracker itself is expensive. It takes researcher time to run participants. So there's a couple of costs here, although the benefits are typically quite nice in terms of fine-grained results that you get. However, it's really difficult to get focal responses, especially on function words. And that's because there's well-known effects of skipping in reading. And also these can be available in parafoveal preview. And so unless you have really careful and creative experimental designs, it can be really difficult to try isolate effects to exactly function words in these cases. And in particular, things like English on, a single character where the next word is the critical word that we're trying to isolate it away from. If we turn to self-paced reading, this is the relatively inexpensive method that many of us have come to know and love over the many years it's been around since the 80s. Deployed online these days, and so it can be relatively cheap and inexpensive and quick to collect. But again, we have difficulties getting focal responses out of self-paced reading, and that's not just on function words, sort of across the board. And that's because of the well-known effects of spillover, where your actual reading time disruption often occurs a word or two after the word that we think actually triggers the kind of effect. So the inability to get these focal effects is really particularly problematic for these phonotactic cases like the English on distinction, where for a correct prediction to be used here, the next word needs to be the expected word itself. Right? And so I think ERPs have been really useful in studying these phonotactics, and hence one of the only reasons that we see these studies in ERPs for a couple of reasons, right? So typically they use rapid serial visual word-by-word presentations, so we're able to isolate on away from the noun itself on the screen. ERPs themselves have rather fine-grained sensitivity to amplitude and timing, and so maybe they're able to detect effects that aren't showing up in reading times or eye movements. And then perhaps surprisingly, but maybe most importantly, often ERPs have slightly slower SOAs overall, so 500 often to 700 milliseconds, and that's slower than our typical gaze durations out of eye tracking or single word self-paced reading times. And I think this has an important effect because, of course, methodologically, we're trying to isolate ERPs to the particular word. We don't want them contaminated by ERPs that are co-currently hurrying to next words down. And so the windows are often extended just a little bit to make it more likely that we're getting those ERPs that are clean from that. But this does tend to lead to slower overall reading. Now, I said that these methodologies like self-paced reading haven't been used. It's not quite true. There are certain cases reported. So Van Burkum 2005 is one of the earliest ones I know of, where they looked at a Dutch sentence with high close probability. So the burglar had no trouble locating the secret family safe. Of course, it was situated behind in this case, they want the word painting. In Dutch, you have two different genders where painting is neuter gender. And they compared this to the noun bookcase, which is common gender. Dutch also marks gender on adjectives. So there's gender agreement there. So this first adjective, big, has a difference between it in terms of neutral common gender. And then also the adjective unobtrusive also has this marking here. And so in their self-paced reading data, they find an effect at the noun itself. So nice about 100 millisecond difference, showing that disruption from expectation, that the unexpected is slower. And they do find that on the adjective preceding the noun, there's this disruption where the unexpected is significantly slower than the expected form here. However, it's really this adjective one that gives participants that first cue that there could be something going wrong because the gender of this isn't going to match the noun that you were expecting. However, these expectations aren't occurring on that adjective, nor are they occurring on the next two words, only on the adjective prior to the noun. And so everything seems to be downstream from that very first gender form mismatch cue in this particular study, potentially either because RTs aren't sensitive enough or because of spillover effects. So self-paced reading is just going to be really difficult to use, even with something like gender agreement potentially. So let's turn to the maze task. So the maze task is a two alternative forced choice between two words done over each case in the sentence. For one word, it's supposed to be a grammatical and plausible continuation of the sentence. So participants will start off with two strings, so John, and then just a starting string to get them started. So they should select John at this case. And then we're sort of off to the races, right? They get two new words that come up. And so they get, let's say, inch versus road. Here, road might make more sense given John. So I select road. And then I get two more words, on versus lie. On makes more sense here. I'll select that one. And then finally, two more words, elephant and extends. Kind of odd to ride an elephant, but okay, fine, that's better than extends. I'll select it. Right, so at each of these points when a participant is making a selection here, we're getting two different measures, right? So one is the error rate, whether they chose the correct word or not, and then also a response time. How quickly did it take them to make the decision to move on to the next case? Now, these typical response times are going to be much slower, again, than gaze durations or single word self-paced reading times here, in part because in this task, it's thought that participants must identify both of the words and then decide which one of them fits the sentence context, slowing down overall reading. But in part because of this, the effects seem like they're going to be more focal and therefore empirically often occur on the word of interest themselves. So suggesting that this might be a useful paradigm for looking at cases where we need to really isolate these times to a particular word in the sentence itself. Now, constructing distractor stimuli for all of your sentences in maze tests can be really taxing and difficult. I've personally never tried it. I applaud anyone who has. But in very recently, this test has been automated using this A-maze by Boyce and her colleagues, where distractors are automatically chosen to be very highly unlikely continuations of a sentence. And by highly unlikely, they mean high surprisal, either because the word that's chosen is going to be ungrammatical or just very highly improbable given the sentence context for a particular language model here. So using this A-maze should make it much easier to deploy maze tests in the future. And that's what I wanted to try to do here with these kinds of cases with the English on contrast. Right, so the study that I'm going to talk about today, it's 80 sentence context taken from Neuland's 2018 replication of the DeLong 2005 paper. Distractor words are automatically generated using the A-maze, using the Godorova language model, where it's trying to match a high surprisal candidate from its vocabulary in terms of length and approximate frequency with given the sentence context and the current word is trying to match to. And about a quarter of these sentences were followed up with a comprehension question. Got 40 native British English speakers run through this task. One removed for low comprehension question accuracy, although overall comprehension rates were quite high at 91%, and 2 more removed for high error rates during the maze reading task itself, whereas overall average error rates for the remaining participants were quite low at 2.8%. And it's a really engaged participant class here. And finally, I ran the maze task in what's called redo mode. So typically for the maze task, sentences end when a person makes an error and then they move on to the next trial. In this case, I wanted to make sure that I was collecting all the data. And so participants were allowed to correct errors and continue reading, following up on a study that was reported by Boyce about this time last year at AmLab. So I thought it would be a useful technique to try to do here. Okay, so let's take a look at what we, first stimuli. So I've got 2 sentence contexts here. So the highlight of Jack's trip to India was when he got to ride an elephant in the parade versus you never forget how to ride a bicycle once you've learned. We create unexpected context by swapping the article and nouns around. So the highlight of Jack's trip to India was when he got to ride a bicycle in the parade, or you never forget how to ride an elephant once you've learned. And so that's how we create the expected, unexpected differences. Under each of these sentence contexts, you can see what distractors were generated by A-maze, and I've underlined the 2 for the critical region itself. Those are linked specifically to the context. So the Jack's trip to India context always has lies extends for the article and the noun, and the never forgetting how to ride context always had lack and deposits as the distractors for the article and noun. And that was so that the only difference here is either or on, not a difference in the actual distractors between these 2 contexts. Okay, now on to the data. First, I said that error rates were quite low, and here, this is just some proof is in the pudding. Here's the cases, right? Quite a flat line for error rates overall. You can squint at the article condition and say, well, there's maybe some bobbling going on there, and there is a potentially marginally significant difference, but it's in a somewhat odd direction. The expected condition, so the expected article leading to slightly higher error rates than the unexpected article, but nothing significant happening here. So errors any error responses were removed prior to the response analysis. All of you looking at analyses where response or choosing the correct word on the first go. And so this is the response times plotted on the y-axis for each of the words with the article and noun in the middle. And hopefully what's jumping out to you immediately is that noun position, right? A nice big chunky effect, 358 millisecond difference between the unexpected and expected cases. So nice case of expectation. But importantly, if you shift your eyes just to the left, you see that the article also shows some separation. 46 milliseconds is significant difference also between unexpected and expected. So this is some initial evidence suggesting that the maze test can be sensitive to these kinds of phonotactic contrasts prior to expected words on the word themselves. So it's a really nice way to demonstrate that this could be a useful technique. We can also look at this from a more continuous measure. So instead of just dichotomizing expected, unexpected, we can look at noun or article close probabilities. And in both cases, we get the same underlying effect that as the close probability for the form increases, reading time gets faster significantly, both on the articles and on the nouns. And so showing that kind of probabilistic graded effect that was first reported by DeLong. Okay, so to summarize this, I've shown that there's some large effects of expectation on the noun, but also, and crucially for today's talk, effects of expectation are also occurring on the article before the noun. And so that suggests that these response times for AMAs are focal enough to isolate these form expectations on articles before reading the expected noun. And so that's goal one sort of in the books, suggesting that this task can be used for this case. But I've given myself a second goal, which was what else could we see using May's response times? And so I'm going to spend the rest of the talk looking at some of these cases. So first, what I'm plotting here is the article and noun reading times. Now where each of these gray lines is a participant average response. And so on the nouns, we can see, really nice, just good fan effect happening here. So, very much a lot of participants seem to show this effect. But when we look at the article, it's a lot bit more of a mixed picture, it seems like. In particular, it seems like there are several people who are just responding slower overall. And those slower responses are where we see the steepest slopes. Right, suggesting that that the effects on articles are really being partially driven by these really slow respondents. And so I got to thinking, why might that be the case? Well, it could be that these people are just responding more slowly overall throughout the task. And so that's what's driving some of these cases. So let's take a look. So what I wanted to do was try to get a reading time calculation for this. So I calculated participant average response times, which has taken the average response time for the 3-word regions prior to the article over all trials. So each participant receives one numerical score representing their average reading time overall to separate kind of faster to slower readers. And we incorporate that into the model. So when we do that, what we find is a nice significant interaction between the participant average response times and expectation, both for nouns and for adjectives. Nouns on the right-hand side, continuing to show that nice effect of expectation. It looks like it goes through all participants. So while slower participants are showing a larger effect, even our fastest participants are showing an effect of expectation on the noun itself. If we look at the articles on the left side of the screen, however, here we see what looks like a trend to a crossover interaction. So our slowest readers are showing these effects of expectation, but as we get our faster readers, it looks like on average, we get some kind of crossover right around 650 milliseconds or so. It seems like there's no effect of the article form on reading here. It's not true for individuals, of course, but it's true on average within those cases there. Leading us to that. All right, so that significant interaction between participant average response times and expectation on articles and nouns, slower readers showing a larger effect of prediction relative to faster readers, right? What's the link between these two things, right? Why might general reading speed be linked to prediction? And here's the idea. In order to compute expectations about the preceding article form, that might just take some time, but it also requires you to know something about the expected word's phonological form itself. And if pre-activation of the expected word form takes time, then we're going to see slowdowns here. All right, so the idea is you take something like the day was breezy, the boy went out to fly, and you form some semantic representation. And then it takes some time to either commit to or access or generate the form representation. And it's that form representation that then is driving the form prediction here. And so maybe that's the time that we're seeing here. That's different. Is it the case that slower phonological that predictions for phonological form are slower? Well, in the ERP literature, there's some evidence for this. So Ito in 2016 found that form-related words to predictable words showed an N400 reduction only at long 700 millisecond SOAs, but not at 500 millisecond SOAs, whereas semantically related words, predictable words, showed this reduction across the board. And perhaps more related to today's study with the English.on distinction is Ito 2020, which looked at indefinite articles in Spanish, which have both a gender component, masculine versus feminine, but also each has in its own phonological form. That's very similar to the kind of phonotactic difference between on distinctions. And looking at the phonological mismatch or gender mismatch, where the phonological mismatch maintained gender, but changed the phonological form, we've found that the phonological mismatch showed up only in a later time window, whereas the gender mismatch showed up in both an early and a late time window. And suggesting that, again, slower form-related effects here. Right? So it could be that the effect we're finding here is similar to those kinds of ERP effects, but it's emerging in a more natural and graded fashion because we're taking advantage of the intrinsic variation in individuals' average reading speeds themselves, right? So it could be that slower readers are giving themselves a bit more time for each of the decisions they have to make, and therefore might be more likely to access phonological form of the expected noun. And by doing so, they're computing the phonological form for the article, and therefore are able to anticipate the article form more frequently on this. That would be a consistent time course with prediction by production theories, in which semantic representations are going to be formed earlier than phonological forms. And it might be that the fragility of some of the prior results in the English on distinction and their replications will be driven by temporal processing factors related to presentation rates, which aren't controlled by participants in ERPs typically. All right, so just to conclude, I've tried to show you that at the A maze, response time are focal enough to detect expectations on words prior to the expected word using the contrast. I've argued that once we take a look at a different kind of data, it offers might be a different empirical viewpoint. And so I've provided some potential convergent evidence that predictions related to expected words phonological forms take time to emerge. And hopefully the take-home message that I have here is that the maze is a useful alternative methodology for investigating predictive effects and comprehension. I hope we all get out there and start using it. So thank you very much.